Hi, everybody. Today is Tuesday, January 21st, and our friend Colonel Wilkerson is back with us. Welcome back, Colonel.
Good to be back with you, Nima. Even if it is freezing here.
I can see that. Larry, let's get started with what's going on in the Middle East between Israel and Gaza. We had a ceasefire. The first phase of this ceasefire is going to be implemented by both parties. And here is Donald Trump talking about the ceasefire and the way that he sees it right now, right after his inauguration.
Mr. President, that you can keep the ceasefire in Gaza and conclude the three phases of this deal?
I'm not confident. That's not our war, it's their war, but
Apologize.
I'm not confident. But I think they're very weakened on the other side.
Do you support the two-state
Gaza, boy, I looked at a picture of Gaza. Gaza is like a massive demolition site. That place it's really got to be rebuilt in a different way.
Do you plan to help rebuilding Gaza?
I might. You know, Gaza is interesting. It's a phenomenal location. On the sea, best weather. You know, everything's good. It's like some beautiful things could be done with it, but
Yeah.
Typical
What is
Trump.
he talking about?
Typical Trump. Well, you know, the very first statement he made was just a bald-faced lie. It's not our war, it's theirs. Hogwash, Mr. President. Where have you been for the last 15 months? In fact, where have you been for the last 4 years? It is our war. We provided the bombs, the bullets, the artillery rounds, the JP-8 to fuel their fighters. We provided everything. We are as guilty of killing, I think, more than 100,000, maybe 150,000 Palestinians, 50% of whom are women and children, and 50% of those children under the age of 12. I've just been, again, with Doctors Against Genocide, who've been in Rafah, in other places in Gaza, treating these children. They are suffering from their own version of post-traumatic stress. And they don't suffer for it afterwards. They suffer for it in the surgery room, which is just a tent that a drone flies through the open flap of and kills a baby right in front of their face and maybe injures them too. So, Donald, we did this. Very weak start, Donald.
When he's talking about Gaza, the way he's talking, and it's beautiful weather, and we can have a lot of good things, rebuilding, and many good things can happen to that region. Is he talking about settlers or he's talking about Gazans?
The former, I suspect, settlers. Although I'm not sure, and this is part of my problem with Donald Trump. I'm not sure he knows. I'm not sure he knows who he's talking about, whom he's talking about right now. Very worrisome part of his portfolio is the fact that he's not sure which transaction is which when he gets ready to do his transactional diplomacy. And let's look at something else. I just read an article by a very reputable political scientist in the United States, cover to cover, 10 pages, in a very distinguished journal. And there was not a single word about Gaza. Ukraine galore, pictures all through the thing of the Davos, of the crowd, of the G7, of the G20, all this stuff. This is a very established writer, a very established professorial authority, member of the Council on Foreign Relations, former member of the policy planning staff at State, and not a single word. Go back and look at the New York Times, read the feature articles, and see if they even talked about Gaza, from what dimension they talked about it. The dimension is Israel. Look at the euphoria right now over hostages being returned. No weeping and gnashing of teeth, let alone even reporting of tens of thousands of casualties every month in Palestine. Not a bit, not an iota. And yet, here's all this. And you watch the mainstream media and you see the neglect of what's happening there. You see the neglect of this country with regard to its complicity in Gaza, except amongst a few. Medea Benjamin, Doctors Against Genocide, 15,000 physicians and other medical personnel together to protest. That's it. You could stir the opposition, if you will, with a stick. It's just so small, and no mainstream media coverage of it at all to speak of. It's a travesty. It's tragic and it's a travesty, but it's the way the world works with regard to U.S.-Israel, Israel-U.S.
How can we understand the relationship between Donald Trump and Netanyahu? We know that Netanyahu wasn't invited to Donald Trump's inauguration. Is that a sign that there are important differences between the two leaders?
I think Trump knows precisely what's necessary to set up the sort of negotiations that he likes to set up. You have to gain the high ground, and you have to smack your opponent in the face 4 or 5 times so he'll be bloody when he comes to the table. And I think that's what he's been doing. His golf partner, Steve Witkoff, the hardcore negotiator. Incidentally, I did some research. New York City real estate developer, Donald Trump's alter ego, same type of person, same type of probably shyster and grifter, working that system in New York, which is so lucrative for people like Donald Trump, and I suspect like him, with him on the golf course when the assassination attempt was made, plays golf with him all the time. Send this hardcore dude over there. He's used to those real estate deals in New York. Have him smack Bibi upside the head 2 or 3 times, and then we'll get some results. Well, those kind of results might be effective on the moment, but they aren't the kind of results that change minds, let alone change portfolios and strategic objectives, and that take into account what's happened to this point. Let's confront the realities here, Nima. The Israeli Defense Force is teetering. It is teetering on a number of poles, if you will. One is you might call it PTSD of people who've been participating, who at least have a conscience, been participating in this genocide. 2, reservists are voting by not showing up or not answering the call. 3, I read the reports on North Gaza this morning, the different incursions, division strength, brigade strength, task force strength, back to division strength. Every time they went in, they took casualties. Every time they went in, they were shocked by the fact that what they had said when they withdrew before wasn't true. That in fact, the division comes out in the first case around Bet Bahun, up in northern Gaza. Division comes back and says Hamas is neutralized. Well, later they find out, how much later? 2 or 3 weeks later, they find out not true. So they send in another force, and that force gets walked up a little bit, and it comes out and says now they're eliminated. Well, 3 weeks. This happens 4 times in this one vicinity. They have to go back in. Hamas is not defeated. Look at the numbers that have been celebrating this ceasefire. Look at the faces of these people where you can see them, and look at the reality of the age they are, and you can tell that they're fairly well trained. Hamas is not defeated, not in any way, fashion, or form, and that was Bibi's first objective. Second objective was to get in there and settle the territory. No question about it. Maybe he didn't necessarily sign up to that, but his coalition certainly did. And I think he signed up to it over time because he sees it as ensuring his political power. Oh, by the way, if they don't pass a budget by the end of March, Israeli law requires they have an election. So, yeah, this is going to be interesting to see how this is accomplished, especially since his coalition is fraying even as I speak. So this has been a really desperately bad experience for the Israeli Defense Force and for the Jewish apartheid state of Israel, and by extension, for the United States. And now we're going to expect people like this real estate magnate from New York and Donald Trump, another real estate magnate. We're going to expect them, just as we're going to expect someone like General Kellogg, who I just learned the other day was 80 years old, my age, to fix. It isn't going to happen. It isn't going to happen. So we're already off to the races with Trump. I mean, we're off to the races domestically with all the executive orders he issued, people he just fired the commandant of the Coast Guard because she's a woman. I suppose Peter Hegseth asked him to do that. He just fired her. And we can see, we're going to see a lot more of this. Well, I'm sorry, Donald, have you checked the recruiting stats for the Army? The only way your Army barely made its recruiting goals this past year was women. Men didn't volunteer at the rate to meet the recruitment goals, but women did. So, and now you're firing the commandant of the Coast Guard because she's a woman who emphasized diversity. This is not a good start, Nima. It's not a good start at all. I didn't expect a good start, but I did expect at least a honeymoon period of 24 to 36 hours. I don't even think he's going to get a minute.
Larry, since you brought up the situation of the Army of the United States, do you think the way that Hegseth is talking about reforming the Army and the plans they're having for the Army is going to help the Army, is going to improve the situation?
Nima, I can't answer that question accurately, but I can forecast based on what I know about him and what he said to this point, especially in his hearing. The Army does need some brutal treatment. There's no question about it. Probably fully one third, maybe more of its flag officers, brigadier generals to 4-star generals, should be fired, summarily fired. Some of them should be held accountable for the disasters in Iraq first and then Afghanistan. That'll never happen, but it should be. In terms of the Army and its direction, he's said some things that I would not necessarily disagree with. For example, the idea that the Army is too small, the idea that part of the reason it's too small is because we have an all-volunteer force. And he's hinted at, not necessarily in his hearing, but in other places, he's hinted at that maybe we do need to have some other way of manning and populating the military, read conscription. That would be a positive thing in many respects, socially and a benefit for the military. But I don't think it's going to happen, because if it does happen, it's going to take an enormously successful national campaign to do it. Otherwise, you're going to have draft dodgers out the yin-yang before you even get 6 months into the test, because young people just do not want to serve, and they will vote with their feet. You know what? We know what that means. So I'm of a mixed bag with what he wants to do, but I'm not a mixed bag with regard to him personally. I think he is probably, next to picking someone out of Sing Sing or some other federal prison and putting him in charge of the Defense Department, we're close to having drugged the bottom of the barrel for potential candidate for Secretary of Defense. Management skills, non-existent. Attitude towards women, absolutely opposite what it should be. Attitude towards Christian nationalism in the military, exactly the opposite of what it should be. The military should be a shining example of the Constitution, separation of church and state. There should be no influence of any religion whatsoever on the military. So I'm really worried about what he might do in those veins, and others too, that I just don't know about except what he said in the past. And what I can see is his experience level. He simply has no management experience whatsoever. And that little that he does has been a disaster, apparently.
When he talks in that clip, when he talks about this is not our war in the Middle East, this is theirs. And Larry,
bald-faced lie.
Yeah.
Bald-faced lie.
But it's so important to understand what's going on in the mind of Donald Trump when he says that. It mean that the importance of the situation in the Middle East is just reducing in the eyes of Donald Trump? Because if you consider the way that he was talking about in his inauguration speech, he was talking about Gaza. He didn't mention that much. The hostages, it was just a little bit talking about, he wasn't bragging about, I could bring those hostages back and I'm responsible for that. I am the victor of what has happened. It wasn't that way. Does it mean that the importance of the situation that is happening, the conflict that is happening in the Middle East, is just reducing in the eyes of Donald Trump?
To a certain extent, but you know what Donald Trump is after? Donald Trump is after a resurrection of his, and probably will get it, at least initially, very warm relationship with Mohammed bin Salman. And he sees the resurrection of that relationship integral to the Abraham Accords, or reasonable facts. They won't call them the Abraham Accords. They'll call them the Trump Accords, or maybe the Trump MBS Accords. But he wants to get to that point. He wants to get beyond this war, which isn't our war. He wants to get beyond it. Palestinians be damned. If they're a sideshow, that's fine. He wants to get beyond it and get back to the deal that he was making with Mohammed bin Salman, because he sees MBS and the relationship he will have with him as being the transforming mechanism, as does MBS, for the Levant, ultimately. And it takes Israel to be the partner in the top part, if you will, of the Levant, and MBS to be the overall partner who will bring everyone else on board. And that's what Trump wants. He'd like to have that happen midway in his first, or I slipped up there, his second term. He's thinking of it as his first term of many, I'm sure. But he wants that deal done. And at the same time, he wants a deal done. And I'm beginning to think he's already talked to MBS about this. He wants a deal done with Iran, and he wants Riyadh not objecting to it. A deal that does away with the 25-year sunset clauses, does away with everything Biden did in Trump's mind, and probably does substantially do away with it, and creates a new deal that will really give Iran some relief on sanctions and maybe cause a new Iran to be born at the same time, get rid of the prospect of a nuclear power, and proceed with this grand scheme that MBS has to, over the next 20 years, completely remake the Levant. And Israel is integral to that. And that was Bibi's plan, too.
In order
Gaza's a sideshow. It's a sideshow to him. And he wishes it weren't there, but it is.
Yeah. To revive that Abraham Accord between Israel and Arab states, they have to understand the position of the Arab state has been changing during the conflict. Here is, Larry, what the Qatari Prime Minister said about the conflict in Gaza.
That we have signed 2 days ago is the same framework that we agreed on in December 23, which is basically 13 months of a waste of negotiating details that has no meaning and doesn't worth any single life that we lost in Gaza, or any single life of those hostages that lost their life because of the bombing, because they are among everyone else.
Israel's security cabinet finally signed off on the deal after delays following internal squabbling. Qatar's prime minister says all involved must seize this opportunity for peace.
I believe it's the moment for all of us today to think about what's on the broader picture. How can we have a peaceful Middle East? How can we have a Palestinian state next to Israeli state, living side by each other peacefully? And that's what we are aiming for.
Yeah, he's talking about two-state solution. They're not giving up on their idea of having a Palestinian state. Here comes the Trump and his position in order to negotiate with these people in the Middle East. Are they going to give up on Palestinian state?
Nima, you have no idea how many times I've heard words like those just spoken by the Qatari from others in the Middle East. Arabs, all. Doesn't matter. That's the approach. That's the way they're going to talk. That's what they're going to say, but they're ultimately going to deal. And Trump knows that. He knows that. Is there going to have to be some pro forma statement that eventually we'll have a two-state solution and the Palestinians will have a place of their own? Is there even going to be a definitive geographic location of that state? Or is it going to be in Aceh province, Indonesia? We don't know. But I guarantee you, I've heard that before, Nima. I've heard it. It makes me sick to hear it again. And it doesn't mean anything if it's in their interest to do otherwise. And almost certainly it will be in their interest to do otherwise.
You've mentioned that Donald Trump is talking behind the scene with Iran. Here is what Lindsey Graham said about what he would suggest to Donald Trump.
My favorite
I will be engaging in with President Trump is to take this moment in time to decimate the Iran nuclear program because they're so exposed.
What does that mean?
Help Israel deliver a knockout blow.
What does that mean? You're going to urge him to have Israel bomb Iran's facilities that are underground and would require U.S. military support to actually be effective?
I'm going to urge the decimation of the Iranian nuclear program. I don't think diplomacy works.
Larry, does he understand?
What a pregnant statement, Nima. I don't think diplomacy works. We know that, Lindsay.
Larry, does he know what he's talking about in terms of decimating? Just these are words by politicians, but in order to be practical, you have to have a real understanding of the situation. And the way that he's talking about it, do you think it's realistic?
I don't even think Donald Trump would be foolish enough. Now, I'm going out on a limb here. I don't even think he would be foolish enough to believe, one, that Israel could destroy Iran's nuclear program itself all alone, or two, that the United States, joining in only with air power, could do it. If he's convinced that that's not true, in other words, that it can be done by one or the other or both combined, then he's a fool and he's got to get rid of his military advisors afterwards or he'll really be in trouble. Because then we're at war and we're going to discover that we have to go on the ground to do that war to ensure anything about Israel or about Iran's nuclear program. Now, there would be the possibility that we could do all that or part of it and then declare we've destroyed their nuclear program. But I guarantee you that if Donald Trump doesn't get his wishes and violate the Constitution and have another term yet, the next president will pay dearly for that because Iran will have a nuclear weapon and it will be very blatantly tested and shown off. I mean, that's the reality of it. You simply cannot destroy their nuclear program with air power alone. An argument ever since air power was invented that has never proved sound, and it will prove unsound again. It will not destroy their nuclear program. So I'm praying that the saner voices in the Pentagon, even with Hegseth there saying, aye, sir, 3 bags full, the saner voices in uniform will tell Donald Trump the truth about this situation in Iran.
It seems that the new prime minister in Lebanon is not the way that Washington expected to be.
Never is.
And how is that going to work, Larry, in terms of what Washington wants to do with Lebanon?
Well, apparently he is chummy with MBS. I mean, that's all I can get from the vibes, that maybe he is part of MBS's attempt, and it's much bigger than just Mike Aoun, but he could be part of it. I think he probably is, to counter Ankara, because MBS is a little worried about Ankara and what might be in the mind of Erdogan and his successor as to who really runs Shia, Sunni, you name it, the Muslim world. That's MBS's goal. That's his desire. But he's after it in very economic terms, mostly. He's after it with this 5, 10, 20, 30-year plan to revolutionize the whole region under Saudi aegis. He's not after conquering or creating the Ottoman Empire again or whatever, which I think he sees Erdogan as sort of having his foot in. So I don't know what that means in terms of the real possibilities for Lebanon and its recovery. I was beginning to think it would never recover. But if MBS is serious about this and Michael Aoun is seen as his vehicle for it, and we could start it, then maybe we could get enough money into Lebanon and enough redevelopment and rebuilding that Lebanon might have a chance for the future, rather than being relegated to being a state of Israel in very bad state. And that's what Netanyahu wants, of course. So there are still dynamics to play out here.
And Syria, do you find the situation in Syria getting worse? Is improving in terms of how the United States sees the conflict in Syria?
I think around the periphery, as it were, on the borders, starting with Israel taking more and more territory, it's not so good for Damascus. I think there are forces, disparate forces to be sure, tribal forces in some respects, foreign forces in some respects, like Iraqis, who are actually testing the waters to see just how far they can get in terms of incursions, in terms of developing things with fellows on the other. We need to remember that along that Iraqi-Syria border, trade has been taking place, illicit trade has been taking place for a long, long time. And that's all these people know. It's everything from petroleum products to food. So there are incursions taking place basically all around the periphery of Syria. And I'm sure Iran's not leaving this alone either in terms of surrogates that should be giving Damascus some concern in terms of its control over its vast territory, vast to it. And I haven't even mentioned Ankara and the Kurds and, the problems that are adherent to the Kurds anywhere they are. I'm hearing signs out of Damascus that maybe there's not autonomy in the future for the Kurds in Syria. They'll be Syrian citizens, I guess, is what we're saying. Well, what kind of citizens will they be? Third, fourth, fifth class or whatever. Will they accept that? Probably not. Is Erdogan stirring in this too? Don't know. But I see less and less indication that Damascus is in control of its territory.
Since we've learned about the ceasefire between Israel and Gaza, it seems that the situation in the West Bank is getting worse. And how do you see the role of Palestinian Authority in the whole situation that is happening right now in the West Bank?
Complicit and to be thrown out speedily by the real leadership of the Palestinians whenever it congeals. And I suspect that leadership will be no different from what it was before, a combination of Hamas and perhaps some of the other groups that have joined Hamas in the opposition. And that'll be the reality. And that'll be the reality that makes Bibi say, see, I told you, I'm back in again. And there's no question in my mind, anyway, that phase 2 probably won't start. I mean, I hope I'm wrong. I pray I'm wrong. But I suspect that they'll foul it even up before phase 2 has a chance to start. Because they want Gaza to be Israeli. That's the way that group, that Zionist group, that radical Zionist group, feels Israel can be saved. And that's the only way. And Donald Trump talking about it being a beautiful place where he could build hotels and sun himself on the beach with a mint julep in his hand and all that. Whom are you doing that with, Donald? I suspect Miriam Adelson told him it'll be with Israelis that you're doing that.
And shifting the gear, Larry, to the conflict between Ukraine and Russia. Here is the link. Ukrainians are just reporting that Ukraine are claiming that Israel wants to transfer Russian-made weapons captured by the IDF in Gaza and Lebanon to Kiev. Here comes the link. In Syria, you see Ukrainians coming to Syria, training these HTS forces. And right now, Israel, I don't know if that's the reality. We have some reports, but we cannot confirm that. But how is that related to what's going on? What's going on in the Middle East? Is that related to the situation in Ukraine?
I don't think there's any question that the United States is using Ukraine and would like to use Romania and Georgia and Moldova and other places in Europe, newly liberated places, if you will, as its proxies in all manner of nefarious activities, be they clandestine or open or a combination of the two, all through the crescent that I've described from the Baltic Sea down to the Persian Gulf. We're using people. This is what we do with our proxies. We use them. If we can't use them to bleed Russia on Ukrainian ground, we'll use them to bleed Russia somewhere else. And you mentioned the Israelis in there. One of the things that fascinated me when we were getting the 2012, 2013 reports from the Swedes and the Finns and the Swiss, who had put observers on Russian maneuver battlefields, so to speak, simulated battlefields in those years. And these were big maneuvers. These were what we would call in the U.S. corps-size maneuvers, 30, 40,000 troops. Was the Israelis were in there big time, helping them learn how to coordinate drones with their ISR assets and such, helping them to learn how to coordinate that massive amount of troops in a specific set of terrain with different kinds of intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, ISR. So the Israelis are in anywhere they can make money. That's the bottom line for the Israelis. They're anywhere they can make money. And it doesn't matter about the law. If the law contravenes it, they just break the law. Just like we do, selling arms to Israel. We've been breaking our own law all along here, selling arms to Israel. I know, I was there. I was in political military affairs with Link Bloomfield when he was Assistant Secretary of State. And we were looking at the laws and telling the Israelis and demarches, that's about all we did, official diplomatic notes, that they shouldn't use Apache helicopters to kill little girls and things like that. It didn't make any difference. We've broken all the laws with Tony Blinken in there. He's a war criminal. Blinken is a war criminal, no question in my mind. Were the world a fair place, were justice to be administered, Blinken would be in the dock along with Netanyahu, Smotrich, Gallant, and the rest of those people. But it won't happen. It won't happen. But that's the gist of what we're doing. I just did an interview with Georgian television, and they wanted me to essentially say, and I did, that they are in trouble. The Dream Party, the Georgian Dream Party's in trouble, barely won the elections. And because they won the elections, because they won, and because they want a balanced foreign policy, a balanced security policy, balance between the West and Moscow, the giant over their head, we're undermining them. We've got a congressman from South Carolina, my state, Lindsey Graham's state, named Wilson. And he's already sent a letter to Marco Rubio naming people in Georgia that Rubio should sanction. And I have no doubt that Rubio will do it and Trump will allow him to do it because we're trying to pull down that government to bring Georgia forcibly on our side so they can be another front against Russia. This is what we're doing, Nima. We're falling apart at the seams. We've elected an orchestrator of further despair and destruction, and we're still doing this. Here's a piece. And this is classic. This is from a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, from a member of the policy planning staff in the past, who's now a Princeton professor. And this is what he says in the opening of his article entitled, America at a Global Crossroads. Like the title, because we definitely are. The U.S., polarized and divided, faces a world overflowing with challenges, dangers, and uncertainty. Good sentence, but I appended to it these words, mostly of our own making. Then he goes on and he says, China and Russia have stepped forward to challenge American leadership and the Western-centered international order. And then I write down below, no, the American empire has stepped forward to arrest the irresistible shift of power to the east. So he's got it right throughout the article, basically in terms of the challenge, but he's got the reasons for that challenge utterly backward. And that means bad policy. And that's what we're doing.
Here is, Larry, what Donald Trump said about the conflict in Ukraine.
Could be very soon.
And you talked a bit about Ukraine and Russia, but how long do you think it would take to end that conflict? And
I have to speak to President Putin. We're going to have to find out. He can't be thrilled. He's not doing so well. I mean, he's grinding it out, but most people thought that war would have been over in about 1 week. And now you're into 3 years, right? So he can't be thrilled. It's not making him look very good. Now, eventually, I mean, it's a big machine, so things will happen. But I think it'd be very well off to end that war. We have numbers that almost 1 million Russian soldiers have been killed. About 700,000 Ukrainian soldiers are killed. Russia's bigger. They have more soldiers to lose. But that's no way to run a country.
If you take...
Yeah, and let me just say one thing really quickly before I forget it. My mind's not as good as it used to be. Most of us thought it'd be over in a week, including me. Oh, what an idiot. What an idiot. None of us thought it'd be over in a week.
If you take his word and put it on a paper, it seems that it's Joe Biden is talking about the conflict in Ukraine, unless he's talking about the negotiations. The only exception is that he's talking about the negotiations which Joe Biden was not willing to talk about. But the rest of what he said is the same type of propaganda by the Biden administration. And he's just repeating those type of information. Do you think that he really believes what he's talking about?
I think that's indicative, Nima, of a real problem with transitions. And I went through one. It was adumbrated because you remember the hanging Chad election and everything. We only had about 30 days for our transition. But you normally have all the time from the election until inauguration. So you have about 3 months of transition time. And what happens is the administration in power contaminates the administration coming in. So I think you're seeing some of that. They convert you, if you will. And so you're seeing some of that. But you're also seeing, and I think it came out in that interview you just displayed some portions of, uncertainty. Uncertainty that they're masking with the kind of bravado talk that, well, Russia's losing. By the way, you got the stats wrong completely. Ukraine is still standing up, but it's got to end because this is stupid. It's gone on to good characterization of the conflict in the general sense that it needs to stop because people are dying. But it doesn't take into consideration what the transition team probably told him too, that he's not revealing. And that is that he feels now, at least partially, that this is integral to the preservation of the American empire, whether that empire is constituted on this side of the Atlantic, Fortress America, or it's constituted all across the globe, the standard America, the America of the last 20 years in particular. And he's conflicted over that. I think he's going to have to make a decision on that. I think he's leaning heavily towards Fortress America, but then what does that mean? What does Fortress America mean? Does it mean the Western Hemisphere with a fence like he's going to finish building with respect to Mexico? And oh, by the way, if you're doing a fence in the Atlantic, why are you doing one on the southern border? And if you're going to take Panama, you need to get through that fence to go down there and take Panama. And if you're going to take Canada, you probably don't need to be talking the way he's talking now about fortifying the Canadian border with the Canadians of all things. So it's crazy. I don't know what he's aiming at. I really don't. And I wish he'd make up his mind.
Let me play a clip that was so surprising and shocking to me, Larry, the way he's talking about Spain, and he believes that Spain is part of BRICS. It's just shocking.
What can we expect of the countries in NATO that spend the least amount of money, like Spain, France, below the 5%?
Spain is very low. And yet, are they a BRICS nation?
What?
They're a BRICS nation, Spain.
Okay.
You know what a BRICS nation is? You'll figure it out. But, and if the BRICS nations want to do that, that's okay, but we're going to put at least a 100% tariff on the business they do with the United States. You know what the BRICS is, right? You guys know.
Brazil,
You know what I'm saying, right?
Yeah, just confusing.
He must have thought the S was not to pluralize BRIC, but to stand for Spain.
That could be the case.
He was searching his mind for who's got an S, who's got an S. Oh, Spain. I'm surprised he didn't come up with Senegal or Somalia.
And here comes the importance, Larry, of those people who are providing the president with information and the way that they're describing the situation. BRICS is an important organization right now. If he doesn't know that Spain is not part of BRICS, I think many things about the conflict in the Middle East and in Ukraine maybe comes out of nowhere in his mind, and he doesn't have any sort of idea what's going on there. This is the importance of those people around him.
And look at what an insult that is to Spain, because it was a laborious task over many years. I was involved in some of it to try and get Spain to become a member of NATO. And for him to make a remark like that, he doesn't even know they're a member of NATO. That's an insult to Madrid par excellence.
Larry, we know that Marco Rubio was confirmed to be the Secretary of State of the United States, the next Secretary of State to replace Antony Blinken. Here is what he has mentioned about the conflict in Ukraine.
Really, if you look at it, it's going to be the priority. It's going to be the official policy of the United States that the war in Ukraine needs to come to an end. It is a stalemate. It's a war and it's a conflict that was started by Russia, but it is now a stalemate, a protracted and bloody conflict, been incredibly destructive. I would argue for both Russia and Ukraine, but Ukraine is paying the biggest price of all, to its energy infrastructure, to the people and lives that have lost, to the millions of Ukrainians that have had to leave their countries and are living overseas. The conflict needs to end. And it's the policy of the United States that we want it to end. We want to do everything we can to help it end. We are going to engage in making it end and in a way that is sustainable, meaning we don't just want the conflict to end and then restart in 2, 3, or 4 years down the road. We want to bring stability. We have a lot of important and pressing issues around the world, and I think everyone should wake up this morning and be very happy that we have elected as our 47th president a man in Donald J. Trump that wants to promote peace in the world and bring it to the end of these conflicts.
We've heard someone a little bit more realistic than Donald Trump on the issue of Ukraine.
Well, that's the thing, truly, you just saw it demonstrated, that troubles me about Marco Rubio. He's smart as a whip. He's very well spoken. He's on his brief. He knows his brief. Very competent. I would be shivering in my boots if I were Daniel Ortega or any of the Ortega clan, Maduro, Nicolas Maduro, any of the group in Cuba. I'd be worried because he really focuses like a laser on Latin America, and he doesn't like very many, if any, down there. So that's particularly troubling. But with regard to this single issue, I could almost say I agree with every word he said there. There are a few nuances I'd change, but we need to end it. That's the biggest thing. And if he's going to work towards that, he will put Tony Blinken to shame. So I'm going to applaud him if he works towards that. Now, I'll have to single that out of the rest of his portfolio, probably. But with regard to Ukraine, I'm for you, Marco.
Yeah, since you've mentioned the case of Cuba, Donald Trump put them again on the list of state sponsor of terrorism, which they were removed 6 days before.
They thought it'd last about 96 hours.
How is that? Is that a game? Is that so ridiculous, Larry? They just came to power and decided to put them on the list again.
That's Rubio's influence, probably, but also Donald wanted to reverse everything he possibly could that Biden did. Look at the executive orders he signed so far. Nima, this will surprise most of your listeners, probably, especially those in Latin America, but the English world too. When I was chief of staff at the State Department, these reports would cross my desk. And invariably, I would pick up the telephone and call my deputy chief of staff in the White House, who supervised state and veterans and others. And I would say, what if we send this over to you? Well, what's it saying? Well, you don't have that country on there or this country on there. No, we couldn't find any evidence of sponsor of terrorism. Yeah, but we want them on the list. Stupid me learned real quickly that lists like that don't really have anything to do with the purpose that the list is titled to represent. In other words, they're political. They're totally political. That's the way Cuba's been for 35 years. I would argue Cuba has never been a sponsor of terrorism. Never. Not in its entire history. Not since Fulgencio Batista fell has Cuba been a sponsor of terrorism. But we find it part of our sanctions packet. They call it el bloqueo, the blockade. That's truer to reality. It is a blockade. And that's an act of war, by the way, Nima. But they're puny. They don't, and that's not an insult. That's just the reality. They don't have anything to do anything back to us with. So it's just a political tool we use. And people we don't like, we issue these reports on.
Larry, how do you see the influence of having Marco Rubio as the Secretary of State on the policies of the United States in the Latin America, in the South America? I'm talking especially about Venezuela and Cuba, maybe here in Brazil. What do they want to do to South America? Is that part of the U.S. hegemony that they're seeking for? And are they going to focus on the South America and North America?
Yeah, I want to see what they do with Colombia now that it's starting to have frayed around the edges, because Colombia has been an American experiment ever since the $750 million that my administration and we had to administer at state went into Plan Colombia. Colombia has been an experiment with Marco Rubio's kind of philosophy, and it is not looking good right now. They're going into Venezuela even to get out of Colombia. It used to be the other way around, you know. They were coming out of Venezuela going to Colombia. So what it is, Nima, is it's the billionaires, the oligarchs in North America, principally, who are so accustomed to dealing with the 5 to 6% of Chile, of Peru, of Bolivia, of Brazil, of other countries. Bolsonaro probably represents that group, that more or less kowtow to these oligarchs' wishes in terms of selling their industries and corporations to them, and in terms of doing their bidding for a return on the dollar, or the, you know, whatever the currency is. And that's what American hegemony in South America and Latin and Central America in general means. It means you toe the line, you in the 5 to 6%, you will be very wealthy, you will be very comfortable, you'll be allied with us business-wise and otherwise, and to hell with the rest of the people because they don't matter. That's American strategy. That's been American strategy. Even when JFK came in and did his special alliance, even when FDR was in before him and did his special alliance, that's what we do. We rape, pillage, and plunder other countries and reward those in those countries who help us. Marco Rubio is no different in terms of supporting that policy with regard to Latin America. And so that genius, that talent, that competence we just saw will be used. I'm told by Cubans, nonetheless, that they know Rubio well, that they know his, I've never done research on this, so maybe I shouldn't even say it. But anyway, I'm repeating something I heard in Havana. Rubio's family is still way back angry with the confiscation of lands that they had under Batista. And so he's got this, with regard to Cuba, he got this personal, vindictive nature about Cuba. I encountered that amongst, when I was younger and down in Florida, I encountered that a lot amongst, and also where Cubans elsewhere were, like Las Vegas and other places, where people actually sat around in smoky rooms and talked about getting their land back and getting their factories back. And you would look at them and you'd say, well, when were you in Cuba? Oh, my father was there, and he was there under Batista, and we owned a huge farm. And, you know, we raped, pillaged, and plundered the other Cubans, especially black ones, because race relations weren't too good. You know, I don't know if there's any truth to that, but I do know that it motivated a lot of the older Cuban families in Florida. They want their land back. And when we began to deal with this, it stated seriously, when I was there, seriously, we began to deal with it. What does it look like in terms of the law? What does it look like if we rationalize relations with Cuba? We really looked at it under the Obama administration when we were going to formalize a sort of rapprochement, as you recall. And we found ways to do a lot of that, and to do it quickly, efficiently, and not necessarily to reward anyone in Florida, but at least to make sure there was equanimity, there was decency, there was a sharing of pain, if there was any pain, between both Cubans and Americans in this reconciliation of land claims and factory claims and money claims. Oh, the big thing with Bacardi the rum in America, and Cuban rum, you know, that was a huge copyright issue. All gone now, all gone. But I'm sure if Rubio got his way, it would all be in favor of the few Cubans in Florida who were the sons and daughters and grandsons and granddaughters of those old Cubans. Still an issue, very much an issue with the Cubans and with some people in Florida and elsewhere.
It isn't so strange that New York Times is talking about overthrowing Maduro in Venezuela, because you have two sides of this story in the United States: the type of Elon Musk, who are the MAGA, and right now we can call them MAGA, and you have the people from closer to the Democratic Party. And right now, both of them are in line with overthrowing the government in Venezuela. And how is that going to stabilize the situation in the South America?
Nothing. It's going to return Venezuela to what it's been all along. That 5%, that 6% getting along with the United States, and 94, 95% being poorer than church mice. That's the way we want it. And this one has a special wrinkle. And you know the special wrinkle. The special wrinkle is that Charles Koch, a multi-billionaire, almost a trillionaire, who is very much in league with some of the others in the Trump administration, and very much an oligarch who would wish his fascism on America. Charles Koch has the only refineries that refine that heavy sulfur content Venezuelan crude, which is the largest oil reserve in the world. But it's dirty oil. But Charles has the lock on the refining capacity. I think it's in Texas. Most of it's in Texas. And that's the major motivation for us treating Maduro and Venezuela the way we do. It has nothing to do with democracy, nothing to do with the freedom of the Venezuelan people. In fact, it is the opposite. We want the Venezuelan people to be slaves to the oligarchy we install in Caracas. That's the truth. Now, I don't know if Rubio has studied the issue to where he knows that's the truth, but I suspect strongly he has, and he does.
They're shifting the gear to the conflict in the Middle East, and we've learned that the Israeli chief of staff, he's gonna resign over the October 7th failure. And if somebody must resign because of that, that would be Netanyahu, not anything.
Baby.
But as we talked about it before, Gallant is out. This guy is gonna resign, and Bibi is there. Bibi is not gonna resign. Bibi is gonna. How do you see are we going to get to the point that the public opinion in Israel forced Bibi to resign from his position?
Either that, or we will have no budget by March, and they'll have to have an election, and he'll lose it. I don't think that will change the complexion of Likud, and particularly this extreme right wing of Likud, but it may ultimately lead to the unraveling of their worst plans. I've seen this happen before. I had an argument with a gentleman the other day because he knows Israel better than I. But he made this statement, bald-faced statement, that there had never been even a Labor Party movement that was genuinely interested in peace. And of course, I immediately went to the leader of that movement that I know the most about, both from my New York Jewish friends and from my own study of the history of Israel. And that was Yitzhak Rabin, who as a young man was an ardent Zionist, almost as bad as Bibi Netanyahu. And who, as he said to one rabbi in New York City when he visited later as an older man, right before I think he had become prime minister, he said, "I've seen the light. There is no way we will ever give Jewish people in the Levant a safe haven without peace with the Palestinians. And so I'm willing to go there." Bibi then orchestrated his assassination. And yes, at that point, it terminated the peace movement in Israel, period. Terminated Labor Party, period. I mean, really, for all practical purposes, and those are the only purposes that matter here. But this guy who knows Israel better than I, he said, "No, you're wrong. They all were Zionists, radical Zionists to the core from 1948 on." I couldn't argue with him other than to say what I had heard and seen with Yitzhak Rabin and seen with Powell when we were doing the negotiations we were still doing. And when we met with Arafat in 2002, as I recall, we saw a willing Palestinian partner finally, and one who had been screwed by Bill Clinton and Dennis Ross and Madeleine Albright, screwed, absolutely screwed, because Ehud Barak and everybody, including Clinton and Ross and all those double citizens, wanted them to be screwed. They did not want a peace agreement. So I don't know what the truth is. Is there a peace movement left in Israel that's effective or could be effective, or to take, some sort of motivation from this crisis and get back into political power? I don't know. I doubt it. But this guy was really convincing.
Yeah. Today, she had a video call with Poon, and in this video call, he said that we will bring Chinese-Russian relationship to a new height. And how is that going, Larry? Because the way that Russia is talking about the relationship between Russia and Iran, Iran with Russia, and China with Russia, and to a new level, is that going to force Donald Trump and his policies towards some sort of mutual understanding?
Oh, I do wish. I do wish. But here's what the pessimist in me, which usually rules me these days with regard to the empire, thinks is going to happen. We are going to compel, with this inexorable movement of power back to the east, led by China, we are going to compel a country that is singularly successful economically, financial, first time in many, many years, if not centuries, that China has been able to hold its country together in one mass and one entity. The biggest problem they've got is the Uyghurs, and that's not a real problem in the scheme of things. Maybe a little bit in Tibet, but that's not a real problem. They have their country together. They're moving forward. They have a colossally powerful economy. We're going to turn them into a warfare state. By force, we're going to turn them into a warfare state. And we're going to turn them towards finding allies that they can count on when it comes down to war. We're forcing this. Maybe Mearsheimer's right. Maybe a war with China is inevitable. But I'll tell you this, if it is inevitable and if it comes about, it won't be China's fault.
Before wrapping up this session, Larry, here is one of the questions that one of our audience asked you. The question is this: will China, Iran, and Russia help Venezuela anyway in military capacities to prevent any coup there in Venezuela?
Part of the reason, as I understand Rubio's and Trump's position, and to a certain extent his new national security advisor too, part of the reason they have a position that they do towards Venezuela is they're already there doing that. Both countries. I don't know to what extent, because like I said, I don't have my security clearances anymore, but I do have contacts in Caracas, and I do have contacts in Beijing and a few in Moscow. And I do have intel contacts with people like Larry Johnson and Ray McGovern and others who still manage somehow to get some pretty good intel out of the institutions. They're there. Russia and China are both there now. So if there's accuracy to Trump and Rubio's concerns about that, yeah, they're right. But wouldn't you be doing it if you were Maduro? Wouldn't I be doing it if I were Cuba? One of the things that's really startled me, and I brought this up with the new Cuban ambassador when I had lunch with her I guess it was about a month ago now. But she didn't want to comment, and I didn't blame her. Why aren't you back with some of the people who could help you? You know, I even mentioned China and Russia. I know they don't like the Russians at all. I mean, I didn't encounter a single person in Cuba, hardcore communist or more progressive liberal Cuban, who liked the Russians. They were too arrogant, they said. They were just too, and it probably was the people that Russia sent there. They were mostly military and intelligence types. And they were probably arrogant, especially vis-a-vis the Cubans. And they don't do black people well, too. And there are a lot of black people in Cuba, as you well know. And a lot of in-between people who are absolutely the most beautiful women in the world. I mean, no kidding. They are just knocked down, drag out, gorgeous women. And some very handsome men, too, who are, you know, we call them halfas, mulattoes, whatever you want to call them. But the complexions go together beautifully. You know, the black, the ebony, and the white, the Spanish and the African, they go together really well. Some of my best friends are Cuban now. So yeah, I think they're there, and they're going to be there. And I don't know. Havana has a real disaffection for outside people, other than like Brazil giving them heavy fuel oil, or Venezuela giving them heavy fuel oil. And they wanted to feel like they were giving something back to Brazil and to Cuba and to others. They sent doctors into the barrios, doctors into the ghettos where even Venezuelan doctors wouldn't go, for example. Or in some cases, Brazilian doctors wouldn't go around Rio de Janeiro. The Cubans sent medical personnel in there, and they were beloved. They sent them to Pakistan. Pakistan, here's diplomacy. Here's public diplomacy for you. Cuba helped Pakistan with its Reeves Brigade and its health officials. And Pakistan said, why don't you open an embassy? And they did in Islamabad. First time Cuba had an embassy in Islamabad. That's the way you do public diplomacy. It's not terrorism. That's medical help.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Larry, for being with us today. Great pleasure, as always.
Surely. Thank you. And I hope I can be with you again if I don't freeze to death. It's going to be sub 10 here for the next 2 or 3 nights. That's like telling you it's going to be 15, 20 degrees below zero.
Yeah.
See
you soon, Larry. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.